Hi, and welcome back to the second season podcast. My name is Jagger,
And my name is Robin.
and today is an analysis on the Dallas Mavericks and Cooper Flagg.
It's going to be structured pretty similar to last week's episode. We're going to start off with some analysis of Cooper Flagg, how he's playing, dive in a little bit more into kind of the rest of the team, what's going on there before really diving into cap stuff and what we think the Mavs need to be doing and focusing on to kind of maximize the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, similarly to last week's episode with Atlanta, Dallas has a lot of forks in the road that they can choose from. So we believe that there's value in analyzing those different forks and also what are they right now in order to make that analysis.
Well, as we said last week, it's really, really important to have a super solid understanding of what a team is when you're faced with a bunch of kind of difficult decisions going forward. You're a team like the Mavericks are right now, where you have forces pulling in opposite directions, and there are some big decisions to be made and potential mistakes to make. It's really important that you kind of buckle down and have a super thorough understanding of what your team is.
Yes, the Mavericks are at a point right now where a lot of organizations differentiate themselves based on decisions they do make when they are in this sort of state of flux and optionality. There's a lot of different directions they could go. Some we would value higher than others. But yeah, I think without further ado, I think we should start with the Mavericks' number one priority and what we believe should be guiding all of their decisions for the next 5 to 10 years at a minimum. And that is Cooper Flagg.
Cooper was drafted first overall, and after a bit of a rocky start to the season, he's really come on in the past few weeks. And I think both of us would agree that he's kind of looking like everything he was promised to be.
I think I would agree with that. I think he's a very interesting no-brainer first overall prospect because he doesn't quite have the traditional skill set that we've seen from that player. But I think as a whole, he of course is on track right now to be one of the best players on a very good team. How that ends up looking in the future is something that we'll flesh out in this analysis. But yeah, as of now, I think Cooper's on track. I think we can comfortably say.
I think what stood out to me the most so far is how quick his decision making is, how great he has been as a decision maker and a passer, and you can really see him kind of improving on those and becoming more confident in his decisions and everything he's doing almost every game. And that kind of intuitiveness and just like the ability to like know how to play basketball, he gets what he's supposed to be doing, what his role is almost at all times, both offensively and defensively. And that level of kind of intelligence and ability to put himself in the right spot is, I think, very foundational to his game, because he's not necessarily the most domineering at a lot of other things, but because he's always kind of making the right decision in the right spot, he can use his really high skill level to affect the game constantly.
Yes, I believe his basketball intelligence combined with his physical size and then baseline of skill that he already has, all that together culminates in a player with one of the highest floors that I have seen in a long time in a prospect, and just a player in general. In terms of when this player is on your team, we talk a lot about taking things off the table. I think Cooper Flagg's, like I said, his floor baseline, his skill set, intelligence, size, skill. Right now at 19, I would argue to say that he would contribute on a good winning team because of all that. And that's not to say he's a perfect player, but those skills together create a really great baseline for a prospect. And yeah, we went over it already, but like the ball handling, the intuitive passing, he's already one of the best off-ball passers in the league. He reads the floor before the ball gets to him, makes the correct pass almost every time. And just that type of lubrication that adds to an offense, it's really, really good for high level basketball.
Especially at his age, it's really impressive to see someone have such a strong understanding of the natural like spacing and movement that teams or offenses, like modern offenses, are trying to create and look for.
Yeah, Mike Prada has talked about this in his work, but the idea of like a young player being pace and space native in terms of coming up and learning basketball. Cooper is clearly someone that grew up in an offensive setting and environment when he was being coached when he was younger, and he understands these concepts so well. And yeah, just the natural intuitive idea for where he needs to be on the floor and where the ball needs to go. It's really good.
So we mentioned earlier that he hasn't looked quite as like domineering as one would normally expect or hope for from like a first overall pick. And I think to kind of break that down, I want to start with just kind of his scoring in general. And I think the best way to do that is to focus on his rim finishing at first, because that's how players, most, high level stars kind of create offense, is by being a really threatening force kind of going towards the basket or getting to the basket. And Flagg has shot about 60% at the rim so far this season, which good start. And that is one of the skills that improves the most for young players, especially someone this young and someone I think we both think still has some physical development to do in terms of just strength and just having a strong base and not getting quite as pushed around.
He's 19 again, just to reiterate.
Yeah, I think that's really important to remember, and I think that's really one of the things that stood out to me watching the film is just there are times where he kind of looks like a pinball getting bounced around between like the little bumpers on the top of the pinball machine, and I think that's something that will improve. He is big and he has a pretty strong frame. I think there's a clear way where you'll see in a few years that of him being in like an NBA strength and training program that he will develop that kind of strength and not get pushed around as much.
Yeah, the big frame, the skill, but also I think just like the natural touch that he has as well. That's a really big indicator to me that 60% at the rim is going to be much higher further down in his career. And usually the young players learning to finish at the rim thing, it's never usually it's less of a physical development thing and more of like a cognitive, what can I get away with? What angles can I take here? Like these are the first time these players are seeing NBA athletes at the rim, the best rim protectors in the league. Not even the rim protectors, the players that are guarding them. Everyone's just bigger, faster, stronger. So learning more or less what they can get away with at the rim with finishing. And I don't doubt that Cooper has the physical tools to improve on that.
And I think that's pretty clear, especially with the touch he does show on some of the more difficult finishes that he has been having to take so far. He gets to a lot of these kind of push shots and jump hooks and just shots that like they're not like super clean, easy layups. And, he makes a solid amount of them, but I think it does kind of play into one of his limitations is that he doesn't quite have that wiggle to create
separation
or to blow by someone or just have that like verve or just
the classic first step that a lot of top 5 picks, number 1 overall picks, they're drafted first and foremost for that first step with the idea of the player has this physical tool and we can develop everything else. Cooper's kind of almost a reverse player where he has everything else, but that first step, and we described it as like the verve and the wiggle to really, really get downhill, put pressure on the rim, create those advantages, those 4-on-3 advantages. Naturally, he just doesn't quite have that. And so it gets a little bit difficult to evaluate, along with the fact that the Mavericks don't necessarily have the most conductive offensive environment currently, which we'll touch on later. But I think that's important to know. He's often playing with 2 other centers in the paint, and we think he's probably a big himself.
What I do think is interesting and what I'm kind of excited to see is if he can, as he develops his strength, can he develop more of a strength-based finishing package or approach to getting to the rim and kind of using his size to really dominate smaller players. And part of what makes me kind of hopeful about that is how great his post work is and how great his post footwork is. And I can totally see a world where any sort of switch, he can kind of half drive, half post up, do the kind of Jokic dribble into a post up and just kind of back someone down repeatedly.
He's already kind of showing flashes of that right now at his frail 19-year-old frame as we're describing it.
And part of that, I think, kind of leads us on to our next topic of Cooper is his jump shot. Out of those posts, he has really nice footwork getting into little turning faders or little jump hooks. And he's really good at kind of doing that kind of spin back, step around players stuff. And as he gets stronger, I can see a world where he develops a bit of that like old man Jimmy Butler, just strength, get my shoulder a little bit past you, and then just power straight through you and get fouled. I could totally see that, him developing a very high free throw rate using those kind of tricks and and his skill level to get to positions where the players are going to foul him, and then using his strength to just go straight through them.
Yeah, I think it won't have to be like a dark arts baity thing. Like he'll have the size and the skill to put pressure directly on the defense just naturally and getting the positions. And then while we're still here, I guess it will kind of lead us into the jump shot, but the touch that he has on all these little turnarounds, fades in this like 5 to 9 extended area, it's a really good sign for further shooting development in general. But yeah, also very effective in these direct post-ups.
That also kind of relates back to the strength and size thing that we talked about, where like the more players that are smaller than him and that he can overpower, the more effective that's going to become, because the number of people that are considered like a mismatch that he can effectively dominate like that will just grow.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think it depends a little bit on what his final career outcome is, but if he ends up slotting in as a offensive second or even third option, he's going to have less capable defenders, either speed wise or strength wise on him. And I really like his ability to take advantage of those mismatches there.
And that takes us kind of to the biggest question mark we have right now with Cooper. And I think what will be kind of the more, almost probably the most, I don't want to say the most defining skill, because I think the most defining skill will be his defense. But offensively, the big question mark is, where does his jumper end up? He shot pretty well. He shot actually rather well in college. And I remember we saw him years ago at Hoop Summit, and the amount of growth and how much better his jumper looks now compared to that Hoop Summit is really impressive. And he hasn't shot it great so far this season. He's at 27% on 3.5-ish threes per 36 minutes. And if he's going to be kind of a full-time power forward, especially one that's going to be like a real plus on offense, I think that does need to start to climb up, both in obviously in percentage, but also in attempt rate.
Yeah, that's obvious.
So you're much more of our shot guru here between the two of us. What are you seeing with his jump shot? What are the signs? What are the positive signs? What are the negative signs? What do you think? Where do you think it could be going?
Okay, so right off the bat with Cooper is you notice it's a pretty wide jump shot. Just in the base, his feet are pretty wide. His shoulders are a little more flared than what you would traditionally teach a jump shooter. And so from that, there's a trickle down. The wide base naturally usually creates like a two motion type of shot where he brings the ball up kind of towards his shoulder, a little Larry Bird-esque, if you can picture that in your mind. And then from his shoulder, it's still next to his ear when he gets it up. And in a vacuum, these are not necessarily bad things, but they have power transfer side effects. One of the big things right now we're noticing with Cooper is how much more effective he is as a free throw shooter and short range shooter rather than the 3-point line. And usually that's really prevalent in these two motion types of shooters. I think DeMar DeRozan is like the most famous recent example of this, of someone who has always shot a high percentage from the free throw line, one of the best mid-range shooters in NBA history, but it just has always had trouble getting out to the 3-point line, both from like a psychological standpoint, but also when he takes them, they're just less effective.
Devin Booker is another really good example of that.
Yes, that's something we see from these two motion types of shooters. So again, not necessarily a bad thing on face value. There's also plenty of two motion shooters who are some of the best 3-point shooters of all time. Klay Thompson is a perfect example. So it is possible for him to become a high level shooter. I think though, just kind of having the two motion thing in mind and wide base, I don't want to discredit entirely his potential shooting future, but I think it's, again, something to just think about.
So where do you think he's going to end up as a shooter if you had to kind of make a prediction? He does have that really nice 80+% from the free throw line, which is always one of the best signs of a person who can become a good shooter.
Yes, traditionally. I think the conservative vanilla answer would just say like probably like 35%, and maybe some years that's 39%, some years it's 33%. If I had to pick which one I would lean towards, I would want to lean more towards that like 39%, 40% eventually. But I do have the trepidations with the two motion and wider base form.
I think I'm actually a bit more optimistic about it than you are. On some of his shots, especially the ones that he looks more comfortable on, those like little turning faders, I think he has pretty good power transfer. And
Well, that's the thing with those little short range shots. It's mostly all just upper body. You're literally fading away. You're taking power away from your legs.
Yeah. And I think it could end up where his three is more of a little bit more set shotty than anything else. And he's so young that I actually have, and he has such good touch in other aspects that I have quite a bit of faith that he can continue to improve as a shooter, especially because he's improved so much already over the last 2 years.
Yes,
And
I would agree.
it isn't like improvement where it's like, oh, he's kind of running out of space and things to fix. There are still like things that, okay, we can smooth that out. We can get you more comfortable with that. We can keep working on it. It's not like, oh, that's a good looking jumper that just doesn't go in because the player doesn't have the hand-eye coordination or the touch to do it.
No,
I think he
it
has
is not
the
that
touch.
situation.
I think he has the touch. I think he has the hand-eye coordination. So I am feeling pretty confident with his shooting developing as like a totally passable four to a like, this guy's, you're not gonna like leave him open. It's, maybe somewhere in that.
We talked a little bit off air before recording how this 27% current 3-point shooting number could look a bit like Kevin Durant's rookie season where he shot, what was it, 28%?
28.5 or something like that.
Exactly. I think we could easily look back in 5 years and be like, yeah, remember when Cooper shot sub 30 and he's like this like 38% 3-point shooter for his career. I think that's a super realistic outcome.
Not to say that he's going to be the shooter Kevin Durant is, but I do think I agree with you where it's like, oh,
an anomalous rookie
he's shooting
season.
38% on 6 a game.
Exactly.
Whatever. It's totally fine.
10% on corner three so far. We both think that's
it's a tiny sample so far.
Yes.
So with that and like the kind of positivity, actually another thing that I want to touch on is what you wrote down about him and his off the dribble shooting and how he looks more comfortable getting into shots off the dribble. And I think in a lot of ways that's true, but I think he's a little inconsistent with how he gets into his shot off the dribble. And I think...
Do you mean like technically?
Yeah, technically. I think, and especially the way he will dribble into his gathers or when he decides to pull up as opposed to getting into a move of like a full-on step back. I think he looks worse when it's just a straight pull-up as opposed to little bump fades or sidestep jumpers. I think he looks way more comfortable doing those than he does just straight pulling up.
I think the biggest like comp or person in my mind that I had, because I had the same thought watching film, it's very LeBron-like, where LeBron's famous for just not being able to take a pull-up midi out of a pick and roll. Like it's just something that he doesn't want to do. It always looks awkward as hell. And I think Cooper is kind of in that camp where he wants to get in his bag a little bit, get to a shoulder, get to a fade, rather than that straight on pull-up midi jumper.
And I think that kind of lends itself to his really high skill level as a player, where it's very clear that he's really comfortable with the moves that he's practiced like a ton. And when he has to be a bit more dynamic and like shorten what's going on to fit the situation that he's in, it can be a little bit of a struggle for him.
Yeah. I think another thought I have on that is like a long-term projection idea where when a player's young and they kind of have this ball handling skill level bag, especially at a player's size like Cooper, we can fall into the trap of if it goes in or not, regardless, just thinking of like, oh, this looks really good, this is really talented. There is a point in a player's career though where like these shots have to start going in, and the marginal line, we've hit on this idea so much in this podcast of a mid-range score. If you're a 40% shooter on these type of shots, you should not be taking them. If you're a 48% shooter on these type of shots, you're one of the best mid-range scorers of all time. And the human eye has a really hard time seeing that. So I think there could at some point be that divide, like right now what they're seeing with Paolo, where he still has that really high level ball handling ability, but the shots just aren't quite going in enough. And so there's a lack of effectiveness there. I don't think something like that will come down the line for Cooper because he has so many other skills that will make him so effective in so many other areas, including the other side of the ball that we haven't talked about yet. I think that's just something to keep in mind with like the type of shots that he's clearly comfortable getting into.
Speaking of the other side of the ball, I think we both think that's where he has the ability to be like a truly, really, really, really special player. And I think that all starts with just it starts with the same place as the offense does, of him being a very intelligent player. He really knows where to be, when he needs to be there, and how to best get there.
So good. Like 100th percentile already for
Yeah.
like this 19-year-old kid. Like he's already one of the best in the league at this.
Yeah, and I think that really stands out with, I think, what his best skill so far as a rim protector has been is or not as a rim protector, getting ahead of myself, as a defensive player, is his rim protection and just his ability to deter shots at the rim and make rotations just perfectly every single time. And he is quite large. He's got that 8'10" standing reach, and he does a really good job of blocking shots. He can block shots with both hands, which is something that you often see young bigs kind of struggle with. He does a really good job when he's out on the perimeter matched up with someone else or with someone smaller than him, of when he gets beat, even if it won't be by much, but he's really good at kind of keeping his hands kind of over them and around them without fouling and making it either an incredibly difficult layup where they have to kind of use the rim to protect them, or they have to kind of just nash it under the basket instead of beating their guy. I'm talking about like these like small guards that he'll occasionally get switched onto that, you would hope that they can blow by this guy, and it even looks like they blow by him, but he's able to kind of stick with them and use his length and his size to really play the angles and make it really difficult for them to finish.
Yeah, I think you hit on it, but the 8'10" standing reach at the power forward position, it's really, really elite. And combine that with his basketball intelligence, man and ball rotations, it's all already really, really, really great. And I talked a little bit about his offensive floor and the skills that he has that really buoy him as an offensive player in terms from a value standpoint already, not even just thinking about him as a prospect. Same idea here on defense. Already has this immensely high floor because of the rim protection and intelligence for on-ball and off-ball rotations. Really, really great stuff. I think from a long-term projection thing, something to think about is that he's in on the perimeter quite a bit right now with his current roster construction, which could have positive benefits down the line. He's getting experience with this perimeter role a little bit, but I think if we're going to evaluate him on like block percentage right now or things like that, I don't think that's really fair because he's being forced due to the roster that he's currently on to play like small forward a lot of the time.
One of the things that you put into our outline that I wanted to touch on too is his ability as kind of that like nail help defender, which is something that I think he could be really, really excellent at. And in that sense, he reminds me in that sense a lot of Jason Tatum now, or Jason Tatum when he was healthy, of being this like really, really long athlete who has like excellent positioning. Because I think that's one of the defensive roles that can be really demanding on your positioning. If you're a step too far in, you fall into the trap of kind of overhelping and giving up wide open threes, one pass away. You can end up not close enough, and then you're kind of helping without helping. It's something that I could see him being very good at with his wingspan, with his size, and with his intelligence.
I think he's already really good at it.
Yeah, he is.
Like when you combine, like you start getting comps like Andre Karolinko and Draymond and Jason Tatum, some of these like all defense, best perimeter defense of players in the league. When you have these physical tools combined with this defensive intelligence, like I want to touch on more on his man. When I say man and ball, like his ability to understand where his man is on the floor, but also fully comprehending what's going on, the play developing either behind him or to the side of him. His rotations on these are almost perfect, but also when he needs to close out, they're almost always perfect closeouts as well. Already at 19, usually this is the area where most young players, rookies, struggle the most, is just understanding the speed of the game and these man and ball concepts. And he's already super rock solid at those. And yeah, I think Tatum is a good comp for this. To be a great nail guy, you naturally have to have great physical tools, or else you're just kind of like a little fly running back and forth between spots on the floor, using your wingspan to disrupt passes and dribbling lanes. That's where the value comes from, and he can absolutely do that, I believe.
The last thing I want to touch on is just how he has been on the perimeter, because he's been kind of forced to play on the perimeter more than I think both of us think we want him to be. Like I think both of us view him as a power forward, and so far he's had to play quite a bit at the small forward. And the biggest flaw for him on the perimeter as a defender is just he can't really navigate screens. He's just kind of too long and dangly, and there's just too much arm going on and too much leg going on for him to really be able to get through screens. He doesn't have the ability to kind of like pop his hips around to get around screens, or have the strength to kind of just like drive between the ball handler and the screener the way players like Lou Dort can.
Yeah.
And he does, as we said earlier, as I just said, he doesn't have the like ability to kind of like pop his hips around a screen the way someone like prime defensive Lonzo Ball could. Right? He doesn't have just the physical capability of doing that.
I think this is kind of where the offensive deficiency that we talked about in terms of his natural first step verve wiggle, I think that translates here to his hip fluidity on defense and his lateral quickness. Like you said, the ability to pop your hips around a screen, that requires a lot of fluidity within your hips, and that's just something he doesn't quite have. Combine that with his, I would call them pretty slow, heavy feet relative for this type of player that we're talking about, and you get someone who can defend on ball because he's so smart and his ability to use angles and his gigantic 7-foot wingspan. But I think if I had to project one long-term weakness in his defensive game, and that's just straight on ball isolation, also pick and roll navigation.
And that's almost, when we say this, it's almost exclusively against like really, really high end point guards and shooting guards who have like the real burst or can really, really force him to play super far up because their jump shot is just so dangerous. And he does have the size to even then kind of play off a little bit, but I think it will be a fine balancing act for him of being far up enough to help or to pressure that and not get totally blown by. And I think he will. I think he'll be really good at it. Like I have complete faith that he will be a good switch defender. And that brings me to a question I have for you: is he just a 4? Can he play some 5? Is there a world where he develops the strength necessary to play as a kind of small ball 5 and be able to kind of do the, do all of the big man things of using his great, his really good size for the 4. It's not great size for the 5, but he is such an intelligent defender. And he has such a good wingspan or a standing reach. Can he be a 5 defensively?
Yeah, this is the big question. It's interesting because the defensive transition from a 4 to a 5 isn't a linear one. The Rubicon going from a power forward to a center, the responsibilities, but also the types of physical tools demanded of being a defensive center in the modern NBA are a significant increase from the average small forward, power forward size. All that preface is because Cooper Flagg is a very solid defensive power forward from a physical size standpoint. I think he is a little small, even if he's a center eventually in shorter stints. He has about the same standing reach and wingspan as someone like Draymond, and Draymond is who I'm bringing up right now because he is the anomaly among anomalies in terms of being able to be an effective defensive center with that physical frame. So I think long term, it's hard also because right now he's this skinny 19-year-old, and you really have to squint hard to see what this could look like in a high level, even playoff environment against, especially in our current NBA environment where there are bigger players more than ever at these positions, and with strength-based skills like rebounding becoming more and more premium. I think, again, you have to squint a little bit harder to see him work as a effective defensive center, along with his teammates also having to be very specific types of defenders themselves if he is a defensive center. How do you feel about his long-term projection and positional ranking?
I think there is a world where you build kind of the right roster around him where he can close games at the 5, and you could have a very, very good defense in those times or in those minutes, but it will require a bit more of a specific player types at the 4 and the 3 to really kind of make that work. I think it would be a system that is pretty switch heavy and has multiple other players that can also be effective rim protectors and have strong rebounding essentially from all 5 positions. And obviously that sounds like any great defense, but I do think this is a defense that could be very versatile in how they approach things, where in certain matchups they could really focus on keeping Cooper Flagg kind of towards the baseline and really letting him use his excellent rim protection skills, or at other times go into a kind of morphy 2-1-2 or 2-3 where he can really be disruptive in the middle of the floor, or even just using him as kind of like a more like zone concept stuff on the weak side or back line that let him really wreak havoc in passing lanes and as a nail defender. But I don't think it's going to be something that you can go to all the time. And I don't think it'll work in every matchup. I don't think he's going to be capable of like guarding like Jokic in a post up. Like I think he's just going to get torched there. He's going to be too small. He's not going to have, and I mean, most people get torched by Jokic in a post up, but I don't think
most center-sized centers,
yeah,
7 feet, 300-pound NBA players get torched by Jokic, let alone a 6'7", 220 guy.
Let alone the fact that some of the best defensive players in the world have been torched by Jokic in a post up. But even if you'd go down like one row of players to a kind of less just dominant post up
like
player,
Cat posting.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of. Like I could totally see a world where he gets a little bit overwhelmed and just fouls. But I think in the right matchups and with the right team around him, it could be a very, very interesting curveball or off-speed pitch that you could build around someone who has just such high level rim protection from a 4.
I think this conversation's interesting because we've touched on before in this podcast that we came up and really learned about basketball deeply during this era when it was really sexy to have this theoretical power forward that could maybe play center, and you unlock all these offensive benefits, but you still retain the defensive rim protection and skill set. I definitely see the vision there. I also think a lot of the times when these conversations are had about like this power forward, can he play the center? It usually comes from a state of offensive deficiency. Someone like Jared Vanderbilt, where it's like, oh, we kind of just have to play him at center because he's so unskilled as a 4, and it creates this weird almost circumstance out of necessity. I think Cooper is interesting because he is so offensively skilled. You can even say he's like a shooting guard or point guard level of offensive skill, his high end outcomes. So there isn't this need of like, oh, we kind of got to like bump him up to center to even make it work. I think that versatility allows you to fit in the talent that you get around him. And I think that's a really big luxury. If their roster construction 5 years from now happens to have all these switchable small forwards where it makes sense to just bump them up to center in the times that it matters during games, that's great. If Derek Lively takes this random incredible leap and he becomes your full-time center of the future, you're totally fine having Cooper as your long-term franchise power forward. So I think the biggest takeaway from this little mini conversation is Cooper Flagg's overall defensive flexibility and offensive flexibility allows you to be equally flexible in terms of roster construction and just getting the best talent and working around that.
I think that points to kind of like a larger trend of how you said it was that was the thing then, was to have, your Jaren Jackson Jr., this 4 that can kind of play the 5. And as you said, it was often from a point of offensive, like the lack of offensive ability. But
like Draymond right now in 2026, like he has to play center because he's such a poor offensive player at this point.
I think the lesson to be learned from that shift and that change is it's often better to focus on, like, the reason you're doing something shouldn't be to paper over a weakness or a deficiency. Nowadays, it really needs to be, if you're going to do something like this, and this is pretty specific to playing someone who is more 4-sized at the 5, you want to be doing it because it really adds something, not because it just like avoids a problem, right? Like Cat is a great example of this. Of they had to bring in a real 5 or another 5 because he just couldn't survive as a 5 defensively.
Yeah.
And what players like, I mean, good examples of that is like an Evan Mobley, who is someone that has played a lot of 4, has played a lot of 5 now, and there are just like clear advantages and strengths to both aspects of it. And that level of like versatility is amongst your bigs, I think, has become very, very important on like a player level and on like a roster level, right? It's great if you have one player who can do both, but it's also important and useful to have different players who can do different things and kind of fill in those gaps to kind of create something that's just more than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with all of that. I think we can now get to, I guess,
Well, we get to the other players. We were just talking about creating something that's more than the sum of its parts, and I think we both agree that so far the Mavericks have not quite been that.
that's the preview. I think I do want to put a little bit of a bow on Cooper's defense, though. Long term, we talked about the specifics about his positioning. What do you think overall? What's the outcome? Where does he rank in the league as a defender?
I think he could easily become one of the best defenders in the league. I totally see how that happens.
Like a perennial all defense.
Yeah, perennial all defense. I don't want to make the.
So if that's like your first thought, what are some things that would detract from that?
The first thing is just if it doesn't end up being quite as effective as we thought. Where it looks like he's doing all the right things, yet still the defense isn't quite.
So
where...
it's a little Wiseman-y where he's like, oh, he's always at the rim contesting these shots, but he has this like 60% finishing rate at the rim where it just doesn't quite translate to what we're seeing right now, these flashes.
Yeah, he needs to actually be like end up stopping the shots at the rim that do end up being taken. It's great. Like one of the best things is to be able to deter shots in general, but even if you're deterring a bunch, if they're still scoring, 70% at the rim when you're the one contesting, it ends up being kind of whatever. So the other thing is that's kind of just the ultimate, like, I think there is a bit of a world where he just doesn't do anything too special, where he just kind of is like solid at everything and like, or not even solid, but like good at everything, but never really develops a true elite skill as a defender, be it being really disruptive in passing lanes or being this great rim protector or whatever it ends up being. There is a world where it's a little bit just fine.
Just a guy. I think I see those outcomes as well, but I think it's really interesting because of now tying all back together, this entire scouting report, in terms of offense, I think that's also probably the main thing you would point to long term, is that the individual shot creation and in general offensive creation just doesn't quite get to that level where he's your number one option and he slots into this second or third option offensively. What does that look like? I think we both think it's a really solid player, but like if the shooting never gets to that elite 38 plus on volume level, or the finishing doesn't quite get there, you kind of just have a really solid dude, role player, fourth or fifth option. And I think when you're projecting long term, that's still a very, very useful player, but it does matter how you construct your roster and what decisions you make.
Well, I think a player that's just like good at everything but isn't quite great at anything. And I think it's important to note that we're not saying it's a bit of a scale thing. We're like, where are we zoomed in on? I think it's very unlikely that he ends up being like not a max player.
No,
I think that's incredibly unlikely.
I would agree, just because of that super solid floor that we've already talked about, all those skills, what they add up to.
So we're talking about someone who's gonna make some all-star teams, right? He's going to be an all-star. I'm very confident in that. But is he the kind of all-star that just like makes 5 to 6, never really challenges super seriously for an all-NBA team, maybe makes 1?
He's making these all-star teams because he's like the second or third best player on the number 1 seed in the conference during that time.
Or he's the best player on the 6th best team in the league, or the 6th best team in the conference, right?
Exactly.
It's interesting to have a player where there are so many outs too. If anything really pops, and all of these things could pop because he has such a high floor, it's not like some crazy improvement in any one spot for him to become like, oh crap, this is a top 5 player in the league, right?
Exactly.
All of a sudden he has the defensive impact of Giannis and is just like mashing smaller players and getting to the basket, and you have to put, if the moment someone that isn't 4 or 5 sizes on him, they're just getting buried under the basket, or even if they have a 3 that's a little immobile, he's just going to spin back around them and just step around them and just dunk it, right? Like there are so many outs for him to be awesome and like really, really good. And so I'm hesitant to even say that none of them are going to pop because there's just so many ways that it could work. Like there's a world too where he becomes a really good shooter and is like a 40% shooter from 3 on like 8 to 9 attempts a game, and then he's like, okay, he's the second best defender on your team, but like he's a really, really good defender, still makes some all defense teams, but he's also this like 40% shooter from like at power forward sized.
Ridiculous.
Like
Yeah.
that world exists too. There's like, or he, figures out switch stuff better and gets stronger and like can really now he plays 15, 20 minutes a game at center, and he's like, I don't want to ever call someone the defensive player of the year anymore because I just think Wemby's going to win them for the next 15 years. But like, it has like that level of impact, right? Like I was a bit hesitant to bring up the idea of like a Giannis kind of defensive force when Giannis was really, really good. But I don't think it'll happen in quite the same way where he's just like meeting people at the top of the square as this like unbelievable shot blocker that also just sprints out to every rotation. But like he could be just an absolute monster as a positional defender and just like always in the right spot, like really great rim protector. Now you can play and you're playing him next to a 5 who's also just like, your Daniel Gafford, Derek Lively, who's like totally passable as a rim protector. And you have these 2 like center level impact rim protectors on the floor at like all times. Like there's so many outs to him becoming a really, really excellent player. It's like, I feel like to bet against all of them feels like a mistake.
When we describe someone as high floor, usually, especially in like prospect draft circles, there's this inclination to think of someone with the skill set of like Jabari Smith or DeAndre Hunter, if you want to go back a little bit further. Cooper Flagg has so much of a higher floor than both of those players that it's annoying to use the same term. Like, I feel like right now, just based on what he is as this 19-year-old still trying to figure out the league, all of the skills that you just laid out very eloquently culminates almost like an all-star level player right now. Like the type of impact that he's having. It's just so fascinating because like those very top end shot creation things that usually are the driver for the all NBA teams, all-star teams, naturally that just isn't quite there for him. But like you said, everything else is there, and he has so many outs to get a little bit better at all these other things right now that he's already very above average at. Again, creates a floor for a player offensively and defensively that, again, makes him already a no doubt max player pretty much right now. And yeah,
everything you could hope for from a number 1 overall pick.
Yeah, and so now it's just the waiting game to see which one of these skills, hopefully plural skills, pops, and he just improves from there.
So now that the Mavs have this player who could totally realistically become one of the best players in the league, they have to build a team around him and create an environment
which was not 12 months ago, was not built around Cooper Flagg.
So that brings us on to the other players on the Mavericks. And the most important one for the league at this point, I think, and just what could very well define this trade deadline more than the Trae Young trade has already defined it, Anthony Davis. He's obviously been a little bit disappointing so far this season. Hasn't been quite the number 1 option that I think the Mavericks hoped for. And now they're in a situation where with new leadership coming in, they have to figure out what the best plan is moving forward.
Yeah, Mavericks are currently 24th in net rating at -4 with the 28th best offense in the league. There are 30 teams total, so that's 3rd worst. And they do have a defense that is 10th in net rating, though. So that could be driven by multiple things. Mostly right now that we saw, it's just mostly shooting luck. But you would think Anthony Davis is having some impact on teams just having to shoot more threes, which swings that shooting luck towards more variant 3-point shots.
From there, it becomes a question of, actually outside of Anthony Davis, the other players that are kind of big potential question marks for this team are PJ Washington, Daniel Gafford,
Najee Marshall.
They have a lot of players who make sense on winning and competing teams right now. And as a result, they're in a situation where it might make sense to kind of move on from these players and try to open up or just try to kind of restock your draft cupboard and have a more traditional rebuild. On the other hand, they do have all these players that are quite good right now. And I think we both agree that if Kyrie can come back and be Kyrie, this team starts to make a lot more sense in the way it's
a lot more sense
in the way it's built and just the way it's structured. And so there is a kind of, you have a bunch of forces kind of pulling in different directions where they don't really have many of their own draft picks and are most likely not going to be able to kind of get them back. They have this year's, which is big, but they've already kind of been a little bit too good to really, really get into a super high pick. Could they pull out a, top Sixers style tank and like get all the way to the bottom really quickly? That's pretty tough. I think there's some pretty motivated teams in the sense of wanting to be towards the top of the lottery. And it also is a bit of a tough sell because there's totally a world where Kyrie comes back and next season they are an entertaining, good team. And especially when you have a player like Anthony Davis who during the regular season can be very difficult to move because that contract is just so massive. He's at $54 million this year and 58 and 60, nearly 63 the years after that. And when you're moving a player like that, it's just really difficult because the number is so big. Additionally, I think the price that the Mavericks, or because of all these factors, I think the price that the Mavericks are looking for to move off of AD is going to end up being higher than teams would, or than I would hope teams would be willing to pay, or what I think teams should pay. Then the question comes, if you don't move Anthony Davis, is it worthwhile to move off from some of these other players who are kind of ancillary pieces and kind of maybe get out of the tax? I think makes a lot of sense for the Mavericks to try to duck the first apron this season. And you end up in a situation where there's just a lot of kind of forces pulling in different directions. And it's going to take some kind of clever cap maneuvering to make a lot of any of these deals really work on the Anthony Davis front.
So I think a place to start with this is to talk a little bit about the paths that are pulling against each other. I think it's important to evaluate what those paths are when you're making a decision of like which one should we do, or should we try to split the difference between a few of these paths. So we can just call it like option A, where they ride out the season, keep AD.
Option AD.
We're going to get Kyrie back. If not this year, he'll be fully healthy for next year. We have year 2 Cooper Flagg. In that circumstance, is this where you would say, okay, so we're planning for the now and the future somewhat, maybe like a 1 to 2 year window. Would you say it still makes sense to get off of these? We would describe them as winning ancillary players, Najee Marshall, PJ Washington, for the sake of just the tax, like only the tax.
I mean, that's always going to be a kind of ownership question where they're over the first apron by about $12 million. Oop, nope, that's the Warriors. They're over the first apron by about $11 million. And to get underneath it, they're going to have to move they're more than likely going to have to move more than one player if it's not Anthony Davis or Klay Thompson going out. And I think there are I would be totally comfortable moving on from someone like Caleb Martin or Najee Marshall, these guys they're good, they're winning players, but they're not really, they're closer to replacement level. I think
in just career progression for both of those players, if they're not at the peak of their value right now, they're on the downslope.
And so I think it can make a lot of sense to move on from those guys to try to kind of just have a few more shots at getting in more young players that can kind of sustain the Flagg Mavericks after the Anthony Davis and Kyrie Irving kind of like when they have like kind of all three of those players really at the best of what those three together can be.
Which again, that window we both feel is really, really tight.
Probably just next year, maybe the year after that. But you're starting to get
probably just next year.
And
so then I think from there, the trickle down side effects of picking this option, I think first and foremost is when Kyrie and AD age out of being whatever they're being, whether they're still on the roster or not, doesn't really matter. They're not contending regardless of actual contention or just like playing contention. They're out of the picture as a relevant basketball team. What is that team around Cooper Flagg, and how do you get out of that?
So the biggest issue, so if we're talking about keeping AD and Kyrie for next year, it is very convenient that both of those players have player options that year, and you also have Klay Thompson coming off the books. So if we can get to that stage, and based off of the kind of current reporting, Anthony Davis is not particularly interested. He wants to sign an extension, and I'd imagine he wants to sign it pretty close to the max. And I think that's kind of the big trap contract for them potentially. If they're not willing to just kind of accept him just kind of taking, like maybe it's just him opting in and you just kind of let it go and you're like, okay, well, this is a step back year for us. Big bummer. We have 36-year-old Anthony Davis, and it's just kind of going to be a weird year with Flagg kind of, it'll be his third year. Maybe I could see Kyrie turning down his player option and taking a longer contract after that, because his player option is only $42 million. You could open up enough to kind of start using that full mid-level and building out a little bit more. And another force kind of pushing towards this direction of like, hey, let's just keep Anthony Davis, is that the Mavericks don't have their pick next year, and it's only top 2 protected. So it's quite difficult to guarantee that you keep it. Well, it's literally impossible to guarantee that you keep it. So all these forces are kind of pulling towards that, and if you do end up going down that route and you just kind of have both those guys opt into their player options, which I think is actually pretty unlikely, especially on the Kyrie front, I would be really surprised if he doesn't end up kind of turning that down and just extending out for, say, another 3 years at $20 million or whatever it is. They don't really have a pipeline for bringing in new players outside of like the mid-level.
That's right there. That is the biggest thing that freaks me out from a long-term Cooper Flagg centric perspective, is that the situation where you just kind of play out the careers of AD and Kyrie, when you get to the other side of that, which we both believe is coming very soon, you get to the point where, ironically, it's like this Anthony Davis in New Orleans situation where you're kind of grasping for straws because you're too good to truly bottom out with it. Cooper Flagg, then it was Anthony Davis, but you don't have the requisite resources to acquire better talent. You're trading for an Omar Sheik there, a Boogie Cousins here, and it becomes a situation where you're mired in this mediocrity because of your prior decisions when you had the superstar player on their rookie deal and when they were still young. Of course, there were also downsides and distasteful outcomes to truly bottoming out right now. Like you said, their pick is only top 2 protected.
It's top 2 protected next year, and then the year after that, it's a swap with OKC. So that's going to be
exactly
28, 29, 30.
So this is truly a situation where there's no great options. But I think with this option where they decide to ride out with AD and Kyrie, I think it's more than likely that long term they end up in a position where it really is the Anthony Davis Pelicans and Cooper Flagg is this really awesome player that we're just clamoring. Imagine him on a real team for like 4 years. And I'm already pretty frustrated by that thought.
Yeah. So if that's a kind of potential outcome on that side, the outcome that we almost, I think that's very likely what would end up happening, because they have a lot of the only like kind of way out of that is they do have a number of kind of like mid-level between, $6 and $20 million or $6 and like $23-24 million contracts that they can use to make trades, but their picks are so impacted going forward
it just gets really,
that
really
it's
hard.
just really difficult for them to ever kind of have this like really great offer for someone that's really good. So they have to kind of nail these peripheral things, right? Like if they could, hit on someone the way Portland has hit on Deni Avdija and like do that, great. But I don't think that's something that you can just rely on.
No, there's a reason why we're mentioning that as an anomaly, because it's the exception. Yeah, I think regardless of how much MLE space they end up having in whatever 2028, 2029, the way talent impacts winning in the NBA, they just won't have the requisite resources to acquire that talent with someone who we just spent 45 minutes on how he could be one of the best players in the NBA.
So we just talked about how they kind of need to nail these peripheral things, and they need to find a way to bring in younger talent that fits kind of better across the Cooper Flagg timeline. And they can't really do that with picks outside of their pick this year. They're going to be rather low. And so I think it makes a ton of sense for them this year to just kind of tank it out, right? Like it's.
You mentioned top Sixers. I think that's.
Well, I mean, it's unprotected this year. So, like, if I were them, I would just embrace the suck this year. Like, okay, great, we can get to the play-in. They're going to lose. I just don't see the value.
I mean, and this is the type of thing it's also really frustrating because like you and I were having these conversations over the summer. Like AD should have been traded months and months ago. Like this is long overdue. They're just continuing to ride out this Nico Harrison vision that.
Well, I don't think they're continuing to ride it out. I think it's very hard to pivot.
Exactly.
From where
They're being forced in
Yeah.
this passenger seat of our dear friend Nico Harrison. And yeah, I feel like yes, the ship is sinking and there's still ways you can make this less painful over the next 3 years and even put yourself in a positive position. But that requires action.
You have to kind of nail these peripheral picks.
Yes.
And some of the examples that I brought up of situations like that are the one that we kind of talked about a bit before the show was can you turn PJ Washington or Najee Marshall into a kind of like good young, or like maybe not good, like they're not going to find good young players for these guys, right? Most of the time you're trading picks for these players. So can they find a situation where like they can get some picks to kind of rebuild their draft stockpile, or can they find a young player who hasn't really worked out for their first team and kind of could maybe be something in the future? Like the one that I mentioned was, would Detroit be interested in PJ Washington as kind of a long-term Tobias Harris replacement for Jaden Ivey or Asar Thompson or Ron Holland, right? I think Jaden Ivey is probably the best example of this, as someone who just hasn't quite worked out, but has a potential that would be intriguing.
Almost to a T, a definitional second draft guy where, yeah, it just doesn't work out on the first team, but clearly the talent is there and is still there. Take a chance. Why not?
Yeah, I think they're in a situation where if they want to if they do keep AD, they really have to swing on these chances.
Exactly.
They really have to, and not just swing. Like I think the first step is to swing. The second step is to hit the ball, right? They have to really do a good job of identifying players who are good risks in this sense. That
they are risks though.
Yeah, they are risks.
You're trading
these
very set commodity role players who they are who they are in their career. They're solid, and you're trading that for the risk that's a higher standard deviation curve, more variance involved naturally. So there is that risk that they end up being ends up being not even a rotation player. There is that risk he becomes Cooper Flagg's co-star in 5 years. There is that possibility floating around in there somewhere, and because of the Mavericks, some decisions made by prior decision makers.
Yeah, the situation that they're in.
It is what it is, and that is almost what they have to do to get out of it at this point.
The other option is path B, or move on from AD, is one that's been discussed a lot recently. The kind of big names that were being floated around the whole time were Atlanta, the Golden State Warriors, the Toronto Raptors. And I think all of those have kind of interesting aspects to them, especially now that Atlanta has moved on from Trae Young. They have kind of more flexibility and can actually kind of take in a big contract. And while I don't think it's very likely, mostly because Atlanta has never really paid the tax. And so I don't see them kind of changing that now for Anthony Davis at the end, like kind of in his waning years.
Yeah, if you're going to burn we're going to pay the tax thing, I feel like this version of Anthony Davis would not likely be the way to burn it.
Yeah. And if that kind of if that's the deal that happens, I think it almost has to include a third team in almost every situation, because, or at least additional moves afterwards. So kind of the big frameworks that were floated out were Kristaps Porzingis is always going to be kind of the big chunk of the matching salary. But to get to the number that you need for Anthony Davis, you have to throw in either Kennard plus someone else on close to a minimum contract. If you have those three together, you can get up to the Anthony Davis number. Or you throw in Risacher. And I think it's unlikely that the Hawks are willing to do the Risacher one. It's probably the only one that I would really accept as the Mavericks, because getting, like, if they would essentially be turning Anthony Davis into, $47-50 million worth of expiring cap this summer. And I just don't think there are places for them to really spend that, because they won't even be able to get to real cap space then. They'll still be most likely over the cap, right? Like,
Yeah,
it's
I think for Dallas, regardless of the framework, whether it ends up being Kennard and other value on top of that, or Ricochet, which again I think it would be unlikely for the Hawks. I think it makes sense for Dallas. Yeah, financially, it gives them that flexibility and breathing room. Just get you out of the AD business, having to pay him further down the line. It's almost a good thing at this point that Porzingis is this unknown, because it is that variability, like maybe his illness that he's been dealing with for.
I don't think you can take that risk. That's one of the risks that I would not be wanting to take.
Not something that you're betting on him being our center for the future, but just like if it ends up working out, and then you have this really valuable player on, maybe he's on like this like $25 million contract, things like that, where there just is more variability involved with it in terms of outcome, which you're paying for that risk by moving off of Anthony Davis. But we just went through how that plays out for the Mavericks. What about on the Hawks side of this? How do you feel about that?
So for the Hawks, I just don't think this really makes a lot of sense for them. I think it's a profound misevaluation of what Anthony Davis is right now, and a misevaluation of what would really work for the Hawks kind of going forward. This essentially turns the Trae Young contract into the Anthony Davis contract, and it leaves them with a roster of like, you're starting Anthony Davis, I guess Okongwu goes back to the bench. I don't know.
I think long term it's a slight roster cohesiveness upgrade, but yeah, you're not trading Trae Young for a slight cohesive roster rejiggering. You're doing this for bigger, grander ideas in the future, and Anthony Davis would be a very disappointingly lateral step, I believe, for the Hawks. This is not the Hawks podcast though, so
we did that last week.
Let's talk about the other framework that we have in mind.
So the other one that I really like, actually, this is my favorite one, is Anthony Davis to the Golden State Warriors. I think this is the framework that kind of lets them fully tear it down the best way and just embrace the being bad for a while. This would essentially involve Draymond Green, Jonathan Kuminga, and then in my mind, I would try to get one of the kind of good young small guards and take them in. And at the same time, if you're going through either of these other routes where you're moving on from AD, I think it makes a lot of sense to just kind of tear down everything else. So you're moving on from Gafford, you're moving on from PJ Washington, you're moving on from Najee Marshall.
Because again, these are players that are good right now, and if they're not at their apex of value, they're going to start declining. So yes, if you're building for the future, it logically makes sense.
And since they don't have their picks, I think it makes sense to kind of just view, okay, we're going to bring in Kuminga, we're going to bring in, I would try to ask for Podziemski, right? Like, bring in Podziemski as like kind of a swing.
No, yeah, again, it's the same. It's the same variance idea. You don't have picks to do this, so it's 2015 Brooklyn Nets style. Just like get guys in here and see what pans out,
and just kind of embrace having some, like, we're going to be bad for a while, so having some not great salary on our books isn't really that big of a deal.
Yeah.
Right.
And I mean, even like Draymond, Kuminga, like relative.
Kuminga's not that bad. Draymond's also, like, it's not great. It's not that bad. It's fine.
It's fine.
You can deal with that. I think the better example of a framework that does have them taking on some pretty bad salary is the Toronto framework, where it's essentially Anthony Davis for RJ Barrett and Jakob Poeltl, who are on big, long contracts. And in those cases, you are not just you're not just sending out the value that is Anthony Davis, which I think we can kind of, where you want to view that. I would say I would be shocked if they send out Anthony Davis for anything less than 2 firsts, or about 2 firsts in value. I think that's kind of where their bar is for, like, now it's worth it to actually do this. Because if you're doing this, if you're just sending AD out,
I think this quibble makes sense. Is that just on AD in his 2.5 years that he has left, or AD plus the next contract? Is that baked into your thought process? Because I think that really matters for other teams taking him, because it's these situations where, like, okay, we get the player and we already have this pseudo agreed to extension, that's part of the value that we're sending back. And
well, I think almost any team that goes after Anthony Davis is already going to have some sort of extension idea figured out.
And we both believe that would be a net negative extension. that you're
Well, it all depends how much it is. If it's $30 million for another 3 years, okay, it's not the end of the world. If it's it won't be because
we know
he
how the
has
NBA
that
works.
$60 million dollar
Yeah,
player option.
we know how this league works. This is the contract for AD that will be the albatross, almost undoubtedly based on his current career trajectory, which is fine if you're trading him to win right now.
Mhm.
He still is at a level where we believe it's the requisite value is there if that's what you're trading for in the next 2 to 3 years.
Exactly. And so
yeah, Raptors.
the Raptors frame, yeah, they have these big contracts. And so again, I think it's really about either finding a way to use Anthony Davis to not just send out his value, but take on some contracts that most people would not want on their books to get more value, to actually kind of build up a reasonable draft just enough picks to like maybe we can trade up and really get a guy if we like him in the draft, or maybe it just gives us more shots or bites at the apple. And so
that is exactly the vision that I'm proposing with this Raptors Pirtle framework, where, yeah, you're taking back RJ, who, fine, neutral contract, but it's next couple years still.
Couple years.
And then there's Jakob Pirtle, which is not a couple years. He has 4 full years after this one on a number that's scarily close to $30 million per year.
Well, they both have almost identical. They have identical contracts starting in 27, 28.
Okay.
Which is funny.
I feel better long term about just having RJ as a player plus contract on my roster.
It's kind of whatever.
The thing that you're really, really getting paid to take, though, is the Pirtle contract. And I think there's a value discussion to be had where, yes, that contract is already quite bad and likely will deteriorate as Pirtle continues to deteriorate as a player. The hope is he's at least maybe a rotation player and can teach Cooper Flagg how to contest some shots at the rim. You're getting a lot of compensation, though, for taking him back, which you don't have right now because of prior decisions.
And I think in any of the situations, actually, this is kind of I have a bit of a question for the audience. I have all of the like exact trade details figured out for almost all of these frameworks. Well, all of them, with like the trade exceptions that are being the type of trade exception being used for everything, where this would hard cap everyone. I have that all figured out. Are you guys interested in hearing that? I don't think we think it's too interesting to add to the conversation. It's mostly for me to like get better at it and learn more. But if you guys are interested in that, please let me know and we can start to incorporate that in more.
Yes, or we can just be trade machine enjoyers and hit does this trade work and the gods will tell us yes or no.
Well, you get to be.
Yes.
You text me and then I spend an hour figuring it out.
Hey buddy, does this work?
But one of the interesting things is they have a number of players who like, if you could just kind of piece together one pick here, like a protected pick here, a couple picks there, you could start to rebuild an actual draft.
I think that's where you and I disagree a little bit. When you just have a lot of these lottery protected picks that end up being in the 20s from these good teams, I feel like there's a pretty steep value decline, and the hope is that one or two of those players pans out into like a rotation player. That's a really, really high outcome. I feel like where the Mavericks are at right now, that's just not going to get them out of this hole. And so I think that's fine if that's just kind of part of the process. You end up getting these picks that end up being in the 20s from these good teams that want these win now players. But I think the vision has to be for a little bit more variance in terms of getting higher end talent.
Well, I think it becomes very important, and this is kind of just a universally important thing, is that you need to really nail your draft picks, and you need to be really good at identifying talent. And I think historically, the Mavericks have actually been rather good at that. I think everyone kind of joked about how like, oh, the only thing they got for Luka Doncic was Max Christie, but Max Christie looks really good this year, right? And so and the same thing with the PJ Washington one. They saw who they needed to kind of make things work at that time and went and got him. They paid Najee Marshall more than a lot of other teams were willing to pay him, and that has looked like a totally good contract so far. I think, they've got the one miss of Jaden Hardy, but Brandon Williams looks good. Ryan Nembhard looks good. They have done a very good job of that so far, in my opinion. And
Jaden Hardy is also a mid-second round pick.
Yeah.
So.
But it's you really have to take risks to try to change your situation when you're in a spot the way the Mavericks are. I think it's really dangerous to. I think there's a big trap in being conservative here and just like
Dude, I think
playing it out. Like
that is the biggest downside possible, is if they take the conservative route. Again, the AD Pelicans is like my personal nightmare for Cooper Flagg's career, and that's where it would go if they are conservative with their roster construction and asset management in the next 2 to 3 years. I think that's all we have today on the Mavericks, Cooper Flagg, and where we think this is all going. Really fun to break all this down, because there are so many options and paths, and they're all have these complicated, both intended and unintended consequences that come with them, which is why we're taking the time to go through all of them as thoroughly as possible. So thank you for listening all the way through with this one.
Thank you so much. Check us out on YouTube, where we put in kind of like, we take little snippets from the podcast and add video and film to it. I think I'm going to do one with some of the cap stuff from this one, so I can show you guys the numbers. And thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to like, follow, and give us a nice review. Hopefully,
Numbers are getting visualized.
Numbers
Look out,
will
everybody.
be visualized. Yeah, it's gonna be real spreadsheety for a little bit.
All right.
Thank you so much. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you again. Bye.